Awesome. Great. Okay, I think we are live. Hi, I am Luke with Tabletop Talk, and this is Christo.
Hey there.
And today we have the pleasure to sit down with Adam Koebel of Dungeon World, and we are both big Dungeon World fans. I can say that right off the bat. Yeah, how you doing, Adam?
I am great, and bonus points for pronouncing my last name correctly. So,
wow.
Rarity. Good job.
I just guessed.
You're off to a good start.
Yeah, great. So, tell us about Dungeon World, Adam.
Tell you about Dungeon World. It's a role-playing game, as you might know.
Wow.
I know. Go figure. It's sort of it's co-developed between myself and Sage Latora. He's my writing partner, and it's something like a love letter to Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
Everybody who's played the game, especially as a youth, will remember all the stories that they have from playing the game. You don't tend to remember the mechanisms so much. You don't remember your that one time that you excelled at your jump check.
Right.
The time you leapt over the chasm of death so you could save your best friend from being eaten by a wight.
Right.
So what Dungeon World tries to do is put that experience into play. So that you don't have to wait until after you've digested all the mechanisms to feel like you're really experiencing the game. So the way we do that is by pairing up that sort of old school archetypal feel. We've got all the stuff that people come to expect from a D&D style game. You get your dwarves, elves, dungeon, dragons, etc. And we pair that up with modern game design mechanics. We started with Vincent Baker's Apocalypse World, which is a really fantastic game engine that he
really is
the good grace to kind of not license, but sort of like let people design from. We're seeing a lot of really cool hacks come from that. What's coming to be called the Apocalypse engine, I guess. And Dungeon World was one of the first.
Yeah, totally awesome. Great. Anything you want to just dive into?
Yeah. So, how did you? All right. So I grew up. My first experience with tabletop gaming was with second edition D&D. So calculating THAC0, figuring out my saving throws depending on what class I have. Multi-classing was awesome, but really challenging. How did you go about dealing with removing all of these crunchy mechanics? And still getting really what I love about playing Dungeon World is that this is the game of my youth without all the difficult to learn mechanics. How did you figure out how to capture the essence of that sort of fantasy role playing while still making the world threatening?
Well, so initially I had the benefit and massive burden of a large group of brand new gamers who insisted on learning with AD&D.
Oh man!
So I was DMing for this group at the time, and they, as new groups often do, they said, repeatedly, we don't care about the rules. You just tell me. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. You tell me what die to roll, and then tell me what happens when I tell you what number I got.
Right.
So there was next to no engagement with the rules at all, and so at the same time, I'm doing that, and I'm buried in the nightmare of essentially playing everyone's character for them.
Right.
And at the same time with another group, I'm playtesting Apocalypse World. So this was just, I guess, early 2010, just before Apocalypse World came out. So at Go Play Northwest, which is a big gaming con in Seattle, Sage and I both had the pleasure of playing Tony Daller's Apocalypse D&D, which was essentially, he was doing the same stuff. Tony loves the old school D&D. And he'd made this really rough, kind of like you have to have a player's handbook and a copy of Apocalypse World to play it, kind of proto game. And we both played it there and started talking online afterwards. And within a month or so, I had stopped playing AD&D with that group, replaced it with this Apocalypse D&D, and they became my playtest group for what would become Dungeon World.
Awesome.
And once we had that kind of base, that playable, we knew what the basic moves were going to be, and we had an idea of where to start. It was really about and this is something that I was a big sort of stickler on, because Sage's experience with D&D started at sort of third, 3.5, and has been more modern. I sort of made it my job to make sure it felt like D&D. That's why, at least in the basic version of Dungeon World, if you don't hack it or anything, that's why there's only human paladins, or certain race class combinations feel the way they do, because I wanted it to feel like that AD&D experience, even if the mechanics are the same.
Great. So you've obviously been heavily inspired by your past and all these games you've played, and it's really hard to be a game designer and not come from some of this sort of history. And for a little background of what we do on our channel is we primarily do high-quality actual play recordings. So what we really like is the stories, right? The stories that come out of these, and this is what has inspired your creation of this game. Would you happen to have any great stories to share with us from your past gaming, some of your favorite NPCs, some of your favorite PCs you've ever played, some dramatic moments? Have a few more specific questions to help you get into it if you have nothing particular you'd like to share right off the bat. So.
Well, I got a lot of gaming under my belt. I started playing AD&D when I was 10, and we overtook the gaming longer than I've not been gaming some time ago. So the funny thing is watching the games that I am playing come kind of full circle. Like I started barely playing AD&D correctly with like my best friend and my brother in our parents' basement, and just kind of hacking our way through it.
Yeah. And
then went through that phase of like believing that more complex games were better games. So there's a lot of like GURPS in there, some hero system, and then eventually you go kind of full scale in the other direction, where I was like, well, all this mechanics and stuff is getting in the way. I'm a serious role player. I need these storytelling, and of course, so you go through your White Wolf phase. Though the funny thing, I didn't know about like Vampire or Mage or any of those games on their own. The first experience I ever had was I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, but White Wolf licensed their game properties to Steve Jackson Games to do a line of like GURPS Vampire and GURPS Mage and GURPS Werewolf. Wow. Terrible. They're just god awful.
Oh, I had no idea. There's a reason I don't know about it.
Yeah. You should look them up. They're so. I won't say more. It'll be a treat. You'll find the PDF somewhere. But yeah, so I went in and I started playing these White Wolf games. Exalted has always been a big favorite of mine. And then in around 2004 or 5, I picked up a copy of Burning Wheel and Dogs in the Vineyard. I got them both kind of around the same time. Yes, an earlier iteration of that very game.
Yeah, there you go.
And that was right around the time, for me, I discovered stuff like The Forge, some of the kind of independently developed games that were, coming out at that time. But since then, in the last 10 years or so, it's really been, and you can see this in the industry in general, there's this drawback to the simplicity of the early games. There's people going back, there's the whole OSR movement, and for me, like the point that I've sort of come to now is I'll play anything, it's about kind of like playing a game for what it is and being willing to kind of experience it that way first. I'm a really firm believer of at least before you start digging into a game, playing it as it's written, because there's a lot of stuff there that I think people overlook, especially people who have a long history of playing games.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I definitely know a big thing that people struggle over is like a certain mechanic that they really like that's been commandeered in some way by a new system. Great example is like resource rolls. It's so hard to get people's heads wrapped around the idea of having a stat for a resource as opposed to a giant hoard of thousands of gold pieces. And man, once you overcome that desire to
beautiful things happen.
Yeah, to just stay put.
Well, and that kind of thing is what game design really is all about, especially if it's something you haven't done before. Porting mechanics from one system to another, just to expand what that system's already doing. We're seeing a lot of people talking about porting fronts from Dungeon World, bonds from Dungeon World into other games, just as a framework for adversity in the campaign world, or and every once in a while someone will drop Sage and I a line on Twitter or something and be like, I was reading the last D&D Next playset, and how do you guys feel like they totally stole this idea from you? And we're just like, we feel great. That's
awesome.
Yeah. Please. We released the game the way we did so that people can take that and build on it. But you're right. Like the abstraction of stats, some of that kind of stepping away from the very immersive simulationist stuff. It can work if it's something that your group likes, for sure.
Right. Sort of diving into that, what advice would you give to new game developers? What would you, in your experience having developed Dungeon World, what would you say to people who are also working on new types of like indie tabletop games?
I would say that if you've been, so a lot of the time people will say, I've got this game, I've been designing it since 1995, and I haven't produced it yet. It's been play tested, and it's got this great campaign setting. And honestly, like my advice to those people is like throw it out. Like I know you love it, but like be willing to destroy it, right?
Kill your darlings, yeah.
Yeah, to just try. Like the thing is, for every game that comes out, and you ask any game designer about this, for every game they release, there's 100 other games that never saw more than a page or two of notes.
Yeah.
And you never know when you're going to abandon something and come back to it, and don't be afraid to ditch it, right? The other thing is, and this is something that's becoming increasingly easier, the line between a designer and a playtester and the audience is becoming blurrier and blurrier as time goes on. Sage and I do most of our development when we can help it out in the open. If you look at my Google Plus profile from the last 2 months, it's all notes about this Mass Effect thing I'm working on.
Yeah.
So, putting that out there, like saying like, here's an idea I have for a game. What do you think? Assembling like free playtest versions and just giving them away for free. Because feedback is a lot harder to come by than anything. Like producing a game takes a lot of time. And I guess that's the other thing is patience. Like be willing to iterate and to take your time designing a game. And it might not work out, but you're probably going to learn something one way or another for your next design.
You'll have a great time.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to pull things a little bit back to Dungeon World because we have you here. So one thing I noticed a lot in the community that really surprised me the first time it happened was in the story gamer community, when you have all these people who are very passionate about free-form games with no GMs and stuff, Dungeon World gets mentioned in the next breath so often. And it's just amazing. We have this great, we're up in Seattle, and we have this great story gaming group up here that's from Meetup. And I remember going there, and people are playing story games, and someone goes, well, I've got this game, and it's not quite a story game, but I really want to play it, and it's called Dungeon World, and everybody just goes, oh yeah, Dungeon World. Yeah, that's okay. We can play that here. How do you think this happened? It's kind of for a community that prides itself on novelty and originality, you busted down the door there in a fantastic way. How do you think that's happened, and what's your analysis of that?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, like, yeah, it's advantageous for us because if you look at Apocalypse World and compare it to, say, like even Vincent's other designs, you look at it and compare it to Dogs or Wicked Age, it's pretty traditional in terms of how it divides the authority behind the game. A GM in an Apocalypse World style game is very much a GM in the traditional sort of D&D sense. They're in charge of the world, and the players are in charge of their bit. But there's channels for that, and I think that I mean, you look at the principles for the GM in Dungeon World. The big one is ask questions, build on the answers, right? And that's the knob of story game on one side and trad game on the other, because on the one hand, you can have a GM that has no planning in advance and is going to ask the players stuff that their characters would have no input on whatsoever, right? They're going to be the ones saying, well, why is the Duke so mad at you? Like, what is he feeling right now? They're going to be saying, who here are you in love with? The stuff that designs that kind of play, because it's enabled through that rule, through that GM rule. But on the other hand, you know, the game is a really good fit for people trying to transition from a more traditional system, because the GM role is still in the GM's hands. It doesn't say you always have to ask questions. It just says when you want to ask questions and build on those answers. So the question can just be, you know, how do you do this? Describe your character's action for us, you know, instead of doing that narration. So I think, you know, we are straddling a space that gives us an advantage that we can play in sort of both sandboxes. And, you know, it's advantageous for the most part, but it's also pretty divisive. Like we end up in a space where when the game initially came out, there was a fair bit of, on the sort of story game side, there was a fair bit of sort of eye rolling, like, oh, another dungeon game, like anyone needs that. You know, and as the game has grown in popularity and it's been picked up by, you know, the D&D and the Pathfinder and the OSR crowd, there's been some backlash from that side too, where people are saying, oh, it's not a real role-playing game, it's just a story game, and you know, it doesn't fit, you know, it doesn't belong, right? So there's challenges and benefits to being in that sort of mid-space between the two, but it's definitely something that we intended, you know, to try and reach out to both those audiences and kind of bring those two groups a little closer together.
Yeah, awesome. It needs to happen. It really does.
So I have a group that I am GMing for. That they're a group of high schoolers. They really wanted to. They sort of described exactly what they're like. They're like, we have to play like Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder or something current like that. And I'm like, guys, you don't you don't understand what you're asking for. How would you give GMs sort of in my camp, people who are coming out of D&D, coming out of the perspective of, you know, the DM controls everything, what advice would you give to GMs and to players about how to transition out of that style of gaming? I mean, you've invented a system that we can use now. It's delightful. It's totally different than my previous gaming experience, but I would love to hear advice from the creator of the game on how we can better play your game, I guess.
So I think, I think there's sort of two questions there, right?
Sure.
If you're approaching a group that doesn't have a lot of experience, it's a lot easier, right? Because in the sort of pop culture space, because of the way that D&D traditionally has been presented as that's what role-playing is. You're pretending to be an elf or a wizard, and you're in a dungeon and you're fighting monsters. Like, that's when you ask someone, you know, what is role-playing, that's usually where their head's going to go. Mm-hmm. And for them, it's easy, right? Because they don't have a mechanism tied to it. They're going to say, oh, well, I heard about this D&D thing, or I heard about this Pathfinder thing, and you know, you can say, yeah, those are just two of a broad range. But if you want to do the dungeon crawl thing, you know, here's one way to do that, and you can present Dungeon World that way. And then if you're, you know, on the other hand, if you're trying to kind of move a more trad group, a group that's used to the Pathfinder or the you know, 4th edition D&D, try to move those guys over to a more narrative sort of space. You can introduce it in pieces, right? You don't have to just say, hey guys, we're gonna tank the Pathfinder game. We're gonna play this other game that you're totally not used to, and I'm just gonna make you guys make up all the stuff, right? Like that's as terrifying as dropping like a Fiasco on them, or like saying, okay, we're gonna do a LARP tonight instead. Like it's gonna be a shock. So you know, you can start incorporating some of the stuff from Dungeon World into those games without changing the mechanics, right? Like there was a podcast that I saw a little while ago, a video podcast. They do some actual play stuff, and the GM is a big Apocalypse World and Dungeon World fan. I wish I could remember the name of it, but I posted it on my Google Plus. But they were doing a playtest of the new Dark Heresy, and that game's like as trad as they come. It's very like mechanically heavy, and it's built that way for a reason, right? It's coming from their war game. But the GM introduced bonds right from the get-go, right? He said, here's a list of questions or statements about the other players. Pick a few of them. If you try to help someone, you know, you have a bond with, do something, you get a +10 to your roll, and we'll give you experience at the end. And it worked perfectly because it's just an adaptation of the same mechanism. Hmm. So make that stuff clear, you know, ask questions, add in little things from the game and sort of work towards that, and then ask, you know, your players when you're done, how did you feel about this stuff, you know? I know it's different from what you're used to, but was it scary? Having to narrate those things. Was it interesting? How do you guys feel? Because Dungeon World, as much as I would love for it to be the be-all and end-all for everybody, there's a lot of role-playing games out there, and it's not going to work for everybody. And for every group, it's not going to be their game forever. So it's a good game to kind of take pieces from and deviate from what you're used to and see where that goes.
That's great advice. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got this kind of idea of mechanically complex and mechanically streamlined. And then that's one continuum, and then we have this continuum of like GM rails and total story game craziness. And I've noticed that it's really easy to fall into camps that say like, okay, we've got if it's mechanically complex, it's not going to be very story conducive. And the more I read game systems and the more I play game systems, the more I realize that's not really the case. Luke Crane in Tor's new game, Torchbearer, is an excellent example of something that's really kind of mechanically crunchy, but is very firmly anchored in, to use a Dungeon World term, the fiction, right? We have this deep connection between what's being mechanically represented. That's not just a physics. We're building this into the fiction. How do you think the Dungeon World system of moves and this kind of idea really hammers down on that connection, right? Because that's what we're looking for in a system, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you can have mechanically complex, character-driven games. Obviously, Burning Wheel being a great example. I think it's a false dichotomy to look at it and say it has to be mechanically simple for it to be sort of narratively driven. But what you end up with, and like Pathfinder and to a certain extent AD&D are examples of this, you end up with games where there are elements of play that aren't in the rules that people are playing pretty much universally. Like if you look at early versions of D&D, like original D&D, some iterations of Basic, there's no mention of role-playing whatsoever. Like it's your character is a personalist pawn on an imaginary board, which is the way those games play, right? But as time has gone on, people start to develop this idea of what role-playing is. And even if the games they're playing don't address it, they do that. It's an emergent behavior anyway. And this is what I think D&D is struggling with right now, right? Where they're trying to mechanize these player behaviors, but it feels tacked on. It feels weird because it's not traditionally something that's in D&D. Like you look at like second edition AD&D, the closest you get to mechanizing player behavior is like, around being penalized for not acting under your alignment. Right? Like it's about it. So I think you can kind of toss out the complex games don't engender story or engaged fictive space. You can we're past that now, or at least the general sort of design space is. It's something that people will eventually, I think, wean themselves off of. And everything else from there, just comes from playing the game that's in front of you, right? Like, if a game doesn't include mechanisms for something, then that's not a part of play, necessarily. And that's where hacks start to come up, right? Like, every game that uses house rules is a hack, right? Every GM is a game designer, given enough time. So if your players want that kind of stuff, if that's the kind of things you want to be mechanically engaged with at the table, then create it, right? There's a framework for that makes it possible.
Awesome. Okay, well, right. The point is anchor it in fun. So let's do that right now. What are you playing right now? What games are you playing right now? Are you involved in any long campaigns? And what are your characters like? What do you play? What tropes do you fall under? More often than not, we all have them.
I almost never get to play. I'm an inveterate GM. I'm always the guy behind the screen, which I'm totally okay with. But when I do get to play, I'm almost always a cleric or a paladin type. I'm the cultist. I'm the weird, like, religious guy. I don't know why. I have next to no interest in religion in real life, but as a fictional thing, I find it totally fascinating. The paladin is my favorite Dungeon World class, hands down. But what I'm playing right now, my DCC group is coming up on our 1-year anniversary of play, so that's a big milestone. Everybody's hitting the big level 4 these days, so.
Ooh, level 4.
Yeah, level 4. Level ascension in Dungeon Crawl Classics is very slow. But yeah, that game's been going strong. We've got 10 players right now.
Wow.
Yeah, we play pretty much every week. So I've been hitting that. Just came off of a whole bunch of Torchbearer. Involved in the playtest for that. So kind of the same deal. And then just doing some pickup stuff. We've got a game of first edition Shadowrun that I'm running right now. That I expect will last
awesome.
Until we get fed up with the system and throw the books out the window.
So tell us. So you love gaming, great. Me too. Tell me about what are some of your favorite NPCs you've got going right now. My favorite thing is to just. It's like I get as many characters as I want all the time. It's awesome. So yeah, who are you loving right now? Who are you loving taking put on the mask for?
Our DCC group, the game, and I think it's a combination of the random tables that make up most of that game, and the sense of kind of gonzo, like Jack Vancian sci-fi fantasy. You can throw whatever you want into the game. It really has engendered this sense of wackiness, I guess, at the table. And I'm not a big fan, generally speaking, of like silly role-playing games. I kind of like to keep it serious. But you know, this game, the players, the initial game sort of started in this very kind of English dark fantasy sort of Warhammery space, and then we got off on a weird track where the players became obsessed with this like moon wizard, and so they got sent back in time several tens of thousands of years, and we've been playing in this sort of pseudo cyber Sumerian like setting.
Awesome.
Yeah, you know, they're fighting the forces of Tiamat, who are trying to destroy the city where humanity lives. It's protected by these cybernetic camel riding guy. I don't know. It's totally off the rails, and you know, not at all what I'm kind of used to for play. But we're really enjoying it. One of the characters has the Necronomicon. She's been carrying it around.
Just got it.
Yeah, she picked it up in a tomb somewhere. Yeah, so you know, I'm constantly trying to find weird stuff to challenge those guys with.
Yeah.
They're currently trying to defeat this this giant that's taken over these woods, and we're gonna figure out how that goes on Friday. I anticipate much killing, but we'll see. They've surprised me before.
Oh, fantastic! Oh, I love when campaigns just there's like a tipping point. You know, you take that turn and you're like, here we go.
The thing that I'm really liking about this DCC game is more than any game I've played, it feels like those really early campaigns of D&D where you both have no idea what you're doing and don't care if an idea is stupid or not. Like when I was, I don't know, like 10 or 11, my next door neighbor was really into two things. He was really into Dark Sun and he was really into Predator. So invariably, every game that he ever ran, we would end up either on the Predator homeworld or fighting predators or like wearing Predator armor. I don't know. So it feels like that, where anything I find inspiring, any random piece of pop culture garbage, I can throw into the game, and the players are gonna have a good time. And I'm really enjoying that. It feels very much like that kind of unabashed weirdness that I think early D&D really really embraced.
Yeah, one of my, I totally know what you mean about throwing things in from pop culture fiction. One of my favorite games that I ever ran was, I took the book Hyperion. It's kind of a big science fiction thing, and I just took a lot of the crazy time elements, shoved it into a world, and time bending is always fun when players run into caches of loot left by them in the future, and they go, what? And then they end up leaving that loot for themselves. Like, it's just like, this is too good.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, like, DCC has the same sort of pedigree, and they're going after that same field that early D&D did. Because if you look at if you look at early D&D, and someone did an essay about this, you look at all the cultural stuff that went into that, like, Gygax and Arneson stole stuff from everywhere, and like just flat out stole too. Like they're like, yeah, okay, well I like this magic item. It's in D&D now, and there are lots of people who think that there are all these tropes that are D&D invented, but really they come from this proto D&D space that DCC is tapping into as well.
Oh yeah, definitely all that stuff. You go back, like you mentioned, Jack Vance. You go back and read like The Dying Earth, and you're like, did everything from D&D come from this? Like. I've got what spells per day. I've got a couple magic items. I've got a couple wizard names. Like,
yeah. All that Appendix N stuff is fantastic reading for sure.
Yeah, it's awesome. Anything, Crystal? Great. Where's game design going right now? You've mentioned illusions about the game space. We're seeing a freakishly massive resurgence of indie RPGs, and the community as a whole is just like exploding out of nowhere, and it's totally awesome. What's going on there? Where are things going? What can we expect? And what maybe are you working on?
I think this big. You're right. Like there's been this huge upswelling, not necessarily of quantity exactly, but of people willing to try and publish stuff, right? And there's a whole bunch of factors that go into that. There's the fact that it's really easy to self-publish, especially if you're just doing PDFs. Kickstarter is huge. It's been obviously for us and for a bunch of other developers, it's the money side of it. You can if you're not looking to make a big profit, you can use Kickstarter to fund an initial print run, because not everybody can throw a couple of $1,000 at a game they don't know if it's going to sell. So there's that. The money side, Kickstarter is really helping that. And then there's just visibility, right? Communities like the stuff that popped up on Google+, sites like Story Games. There's this space now where if you've got an idea for a game, you can find playtesters, you can find other designers to bounce ideas off of. It's fantastic, because there's no way for anyone to develop a good game in a vacuum, in a bubble, right? Like if you and your home group are the only people who've ever seen a game and you go straight to Kickstarter, you're on a dark path.
Yeah.
A bad place, So I think that's responsible for a lot of these would-be game designers, a lot of people who want to publish their own stuff, kind of coming out of the woodwork. It's pretty fantastic. And as far as where design is going, it's going in a whole bunch of different directions at once. There's this whole sort of nano game movement. Everybody releasing these little 300-word games. There's obviously all the momentum coming from Apocalypse World, the hacks that are coming from that. We're starting to see second-generation hacks now. Like there's a Shadowrun hack I just saw on a forum thread a while ago called Sixth World. That's a hack of Dungeon World, which is a hack of Apocalypse World, right? So the sort of infrastructure and ecosystem of that game is really starting to spread, and that'll peter out over time as the kind of hardcore crowd loses interest in that engine. But I think it's got some legs outside of that. People are going to pick it up, use it as a framework to develop their own games, because the core concept is so simple. And I think that we're starting to see, especially because it's easier now to print special cards and to do custom pieces and stuff. We're starting to see the dream that Fantasy Flight had with Warhammer 3rd start to come true in a smaller space. I don't know if you guys have seen 3rd edition Warhammer Fantasy, but it's crazy. It's like Fantasy Flight realized that they had both a license to print of a really popular IP as a role-playing game, and they had factories in China for making board game parts. And they were like, let's make something out of this. And so they have this insane Frankenstein of role-playing game and board game, and you're slotting pieces into your character sheet, and it's crazy and incredibly top-heavy and not that great as a game, but as an experiment, it was fantastic. I go back and look at it all the time because there's this space around incorporating weird dice and cards and boards into role-playing games that is becoming more and more possible now. So I think people are starting to look to branch out at the mechanisms that are available to them above and beyond, a handful of D6s.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, just like you were saying about the community, I've been working on a game for a little while, like everybody else. That's focused on context shifts, like like Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz style. You know how they do transitions from scene to scene? Like they'll be talking one place and they'll having the same conversation in a different location. The game is about that, and I remember the second I went and looked for people to help me out with that. It was just like there's a million people willing to play your game, willing to eat your game, willing to read what you've written. It's totally awesome. It's like
absolutely. And the thing is too is that there's this broader awareness too, just because of the internet and the space that RPGs are taking up on it, of availability of half-finished or small press games, where you can look at games that might be an inspiration to what you're working on. You know, like you'd never have been exposed to them before, but you post an idea for a game, people are gonna be like, oh, that sounds like Primetime Adventures, or oh, that sounds like Inspectors. And you know, look at those and say, okay, well, like there's some stuff that I like, here's some stuff I don't like, and it's gonna inform your design. So you're not coming at it blind. You're not like, I've only ever played 4th edition D&D, so here's my game based on what I know about RPGs, which is that game. One of the guys from Penny Arcade was developing or is developing a role-playing game, and to me it seems that he's kind of in that space where he played a bunch of 4th edition, kind of got some ideas about a game, and is developing this game. And you know, the communities that I belong to, these sort of indie game design communities, everyone was just like reaching out to him being like, look man, you have to like playtest this stuff, read all these games, like the game you're designing is a lot like this other stuff. You know, and so there's that exposure that if you're willing to do a little research, you're willing to go out there, and you're willing to listen to people's feedback, you're going to end up with either abandoning your game because someone already did what you want and they're done, right? You got the game you wanted, or you know, there's some stuff you can learn. You can pick up on existing design and build something cool.
Totally, yeah. I was definitely. I was working on a little thing for a little Fate hack, and then Fate Core came out, and it was exactly what I was doing, and I was like, I'm done. Yeah. Project's over. I can play this instead.
You invariably get one of these two responses. You're either like, shit, someone stole my idea.
Yeah.
Or you're like, oh, thank God I don't have to finish this game.
Like, probably wasn't going to finish anyway. It was way too much work. So, awesome, Adam. Thank you so much for sitting down with us. Where can people pick up a copy of Dungeon World or figure out what's more about or get some free stuff from you?
So the entire text of Dungeon World, the whole game minus the bells and whistles, is available online for free. So if you want to check it out, just Google Dungeon World. There's lots of sites there. There's actually a fan site. If you look up Dungeon World Gazetteer, someone has taken the text of the game and made it into this really cool HTML site. You can search and categorize. It's fantastic. I use it as a rules reference more often than the PDF.
Awesome.
So if you want to check out the game, the whole game is available. If you have questions about it, you want to ask how the game works, the Google Plus community, the Tavern, we just broke 2,000 members this week. Obviously, there's a subreddit, the RPG subreddit, story games. We have our own forum. It's all over the place.
It's all everywhere.
So if you want to learn about the game, Google is your friend. If you want to buy it, if you want the PDF, you can go to DriveThruRPG, or IPR has a pre-order open right now for our second print run, which should be done very soon. So you can head over to Indie Press Revolution and pick it up there.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Adam, for taking some time to sit with us.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Make some more games for us. We want to play them.
I'm working on it.
All right. Thanks, Adam.
No problem.